What does it feel like when an entire ecosystem starts dying right before your eyes? Marine biologist Dr. Jodie Rummer of the James Cook University in Australia was in the water when she saw it happen. 31-degree water temperatures. Her dive computer flashing numbers she'd only simulated in labs. Within a week, the Great Barrier Reef began bleaching. In this episode, Jodie takes us inside the physiology of climate change. She reveals how fish are like athletes, tracking their VO2 Max, their blood chemistry, their recovery rates, to understand exactly how ocean warming is pushing marine life beyond its limits. You'll discover why these creatures, with 450 million years of evolutionary success, are facing challenges they can't adapt to fast enough. Why baby walking sharks hide during the day when it's too hot, and why the data from coral reefs is a warning signal for all of us on land. This isn't just about fish, it's about what happens when the planet's most resilient athletes start losing their race against time. From hope found in data to standing up for inconvenient truths, this is a conversation that makes climate change tangible. I have to admit, at times my heart got heavy because I like these stories of hope, but sometimes you can't turn an eye on the truth. And I think this episode is portraying that perfectly. So without further ado, let's dive right in. This is Where the Ocean Meets Dr. Jodie Rummer. Hi, Jodie. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Your TED Talk I saw happened 10 years ago. How is the Great Barrier Reef doing today compared to back then?
Wow, I can't believe it's already been 10 years since I gave my TED Talk. That's the talk that I still to this day have prepared the most for in my entire career. And I get to give talks at conferences and seminars, and I teach here at James Cook University, where I'm based in Australia. And I still have never spent more time on a talk than I did for that one. And I was so proud of it. But, everyone is their worst critic. And so I do go back and I look at it and think I could have said that differently. But, I really talked about the athletes of the Great Barrier Reef in that TED Talk. And that's very much how I present the work that I do. Now, here on the Great Barrier Reef, those athletes are facing some of the hardest challenges that they've ever faced. Since then, we've had a lot of bleaching events in the past decade, record back-to-back bleaching events. And that's due to these heat waves that the Great Barrier Reef has faced that have resulted in a lot of detriment, a lot of damage, and a lot of mortality to the coral reefs that make up the Great Barrier Reef, and also the organisms that call the Great Barrier Reef home. So it hasn't been a great decade of training for all of those athletes, and some unprecedented damage that's been faced by the Great Barrier Reef over that time period as well.
How can I imagine a heat wave in the ocean?
Well, the oceans absorb a lot of the excess heat that we emit into the atmosphere as humans with the industrialization that we've done, with the fossil fuels that we produce, that blanket of heat that is in the atmosphere. A lot of that is absorbed by the oceans. So we are seeing a progressive warming of the oceans. And that extra heat is faced by the organisms that live in the oceans. A lot of those organisms are what we used to call as cold-blooded. So their body temperature reflects that of their environment. So if their environment is 25 degrees Celsius, that's what their body temperature is as well. And what we see with a lot of those organisms, just based on pure physics, is that as temperatures increase, so do all of the reactions that happen in their body. So does their metabolism. So everything increases. Everything becomes more expensive with increased temperatures. So it becomes a challenge in terms of resources. And as temperatures increase, as metabolism increases, we need more fuel to fuel that metabolism. Need more food. So it changes the whole dynamic of the ecosystem. Now, what I saw, the first time I saw a heat wave happen on the Great Barrier Reef was in 2016. I was up at Lizard Island Research Station, which is in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. And it's stunning. It's beautiful. It's some of the most pristine, colorful, biodiverse parts of the Great Barrier Reef that I'd ever seen. And world-class research station as well. It's run by the Australian Museum. Absolutely amazing. I pinch myself every time I went up there to do a project because I couldn't believe that my career had led me to get to call this place my office for a period of time. We were in the water. I had Dr. Jacob Johansson, who was a postdoc with me at the time. He's now a faculty at the University of Hawaii. He was with me. I think Dr. Bridie Allen was with me at the time as well. She is now faculty at the University of Otago in New Zealand. We had a few students, PhD students, master students, and we were doing a project where we were simulating sort of mid-century and end-of-century ocean warming conditions in the laboratories there at Lizard Island Research Station. We were collecting fish from the reef and then doing various performance tests on them, measuring various traits associated with their metabolism. We were in the water, and I remember this so vividly. We had our dive computers on our wrists, and we must have been doing a shallow dive, or maybe we were just snorkeling. And we looked at our dive computers, and it was me and Jacob in the water at the time. And our dive computers were saying like 31 degrees. And we were like, this is really, really warm. This is February 20th, 2016. And so we're in the heat of our summer, but this is really, really warm. These are some of the temperatures that we are simulating in the laboratory right now for sort of mid-century, end-of-century conditions. It's already happening here on the reef. And sure enough, that week, the reef started facing a coral bleaching event. Now, I'd never seen that happen in person. And I saw it all unfold within that week. And then over the following weeks. So we kind of pivoted that year, and we changed the study to sample fish that were experiencing this coral bleaching that was due to this heat wave. Before the heat wave started, we had already sampled some fish right when the heat wave began, and then in the middle of that heat wave. And then later on in July, after that heat wave had definitely finished, we were in sort of winter conditions, if you can call it that. And it really opened my eyes. Like I said, I'd never seen coral bleaching before. I didn't really understand it. I'm a fish physiologist. I'm a fish scientist. And to see the symbiosis between the coral and the algae divorce, essentially split, and the coral lost that algae that gave that whole organism its color. The algae also photosynthesizes, so it provides the food for the coral. The coral provides the structure for the algae, and that relationship splits up under heat stress. And then we see this stark white color because the coral loses its color, which gives it that namesake of coral bleaching. And if it goes on for too long, it can't recover. That relationship is irreparable. And then we start to see the death in the water. We start to see the other organisms leave the reef. We start to see other kinds of algae sort of take over. And we see this sort of like doom and gloom look to the reef. And if conditions don't become favorable, we do see mortality. And it was shocking. It was sobering. What was worse is that it happened again the next year. And then again, a couple years later, and then again, and then again. And we started seeing this repeat cycle on the Great Barrier Reef, 2,300 kilometers of continuous coral reef that kept getting these heat waves over and over and over again here in this past decade.
It's insane. I mean, sometimes you hear these stories of people that go to space and see the blue planet, and then they rethink everything and have a completely different relation to it. What happened to you in that week or do you remember what was going through your head when you first saw that coral bleach event? Because it basically makes climate change tangible, no?
I had this sense of urgency that I never had before. Um, I thought we had a lot more time. I think a lot of us thought that. And that it sort of sped up a lot of what I was doing. It gave that sense of urgency to a lot of the studies I was commencing with my job here at James Cook University. I mean, I was hired here in 2011 to understand how coral reef fishes are coping with climate change, and it was still sort of very new at that time. But 5 years after I was hired, that sense of urgency was so heightened. So I guess it really sped up a lot of what I was doing, and also I guess, encouraged me to focus on the communication aspect of the science that I was doing and the importance of making our work accessible to the broader public, to our constituency, people that were voting, so that change could happen, and communicating that sense of urgency that the reef was in trouble and is in trouble.
So that we as humans have the tendency to see everything through our own lens and put human emotions on animals and on ecosystems and all that. But I couldn't help it when I saw your TED talk when you were describing how the gills change, and now also when you mentioned that the body temperature is basically that of the ocean around fish in many cases. Can I imagine that it's almost like having a fever paired with a very bad cold, like where your lungs clog up, where you have mucus in your lungs? Is that what the fish are going through?
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of the different stressors that we're trying to understand how fish are coping with increased turbidity in their water, increased sediment in their water, higher temperatures. Just like if we have a cold or if we have a fever, if we aren't able to heal quickly and find like a new homeostasis, a new steady state in our own body, then yeah, it does become a big problem. And that's what we're seeing with reef fishes, with sharks, not just here on the Great Barrier Reef, but on coral reefs and marine ecosystems worldwide, is that these conditions are happening so quickly that they aren't able to make those adjustments fast enough within their lifetime, but then also over multiple generations, which is what adaptation is. So we're not getting enough generations going by fast enough to make those genetic changes to cope with those new conditions. So we see it on a short-term basis that we can't cope fast enough, but we also see it on that longer term basis over generations that the genes aren't changing fast enough. The DNA isn't changing fast enough to cope with those new conditions either.
So basically the fish are really suffering through this period. Can you break down your research a little bit for those that haven't seen the podcast yet? Where did you start? How did you get into to that field? Why is it important? 3 questions. Maybe we start with how you got into that specific field.
Well, I have always been drawn to endurance. I myself I'm an athlete. I'm really interested in the types of endurance that push your body, but I also like to push my mind as well. So I think that physiology is a great approach to the types of science that I do because I like to match what I do in my personal life to what I do in my professional life. I mean, I just found out I got into the Sydney Marathon, so I'm gonna start training for that early next
Nice.
year, which is really exciting. I love long road cycling races. I love mountain biking, climbing, long bike packing trips, and I guess, um, I sort of mix my love of endurance and adventure with the way that I see the world and the way that I do my science. And that kind of leads to like as an athlete, I think about all of those traits that are necessary for performance. I think about oxygen, I think about movement, I think about recovery. And then I translate that to my life as my career as a marine biologist. And I study those things in the coral reef fishes that are so beautiful and colorful underwater and the sharks that I research. And so I look at how they handle their extreme environments, which of course for them it's those rising temperatures, it's the decrease in oxygen, it's all those changing environmental conditions that come with loss of habitat that come with coastal development. And so it's essentially, it's their physiology under pressure as well. A shark that's surviving a warming reef, or it's me pushing through the last kilometer of a race. I think it teaches you a lot of respect for limits, for adaptation, for resilience, for those threads that tie all those things together. And I think that for me, it's endurance, it's adaptation. And I can't separate my personal life from my career in that respect, because one inspires the other so much. So maybe that's kind of answering all of your questions in one go,
Uh,
maybe?
Yeah, I think at least partially already. What I would like to understand is why it's important that we understand how fish cope with climate change.
Well, without the marine environment, we have no humans. We depend on the marine environment for so many things, whether it be if we're living in a small island nation, maybe that's the only place we get our protein, our food. Maybe trading fish is our currency. We can see that on a global perspective as well. But, the oceans are our lifeline in terms of oxygen production and productivity, in terms of large scale atmospheric patterns. It is our lifeline. So if we're not protecting every aspect of that ecosystem, then we're not protecting ourselves either.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and obviously, I think these fish also deserve a good life. So, first of all, thank you very much for the research that you do, and I want to get a bit more into the methodology, because when I saw your TED Talk, there was this brief scene where you compared a treadmill to the setup on how you train or how you research the fish. Everyone who's ever been to a doctor to get their circulatory system checked knows that you get attached to a bunch of cables. Now you can't just put a Whoop on or a Garmin on a shark and say now
Oh, we
swim. And
try.
how do you actually get to the test results that you need? How can I imagine such a setup?
Well, I mean, we're inspired by a lot of the technology we do use for humans, and that's why it is so important for me to keep my love of human physiology, my own athletic performance, and my own love of adventure and endurance to help me inspire the work that I do. Yeah, I've got a Garmin. I follow my own data every day. Love it. Um, you know, a couple of the traits that I follow for myself with my running and with my cycling is a metric called VO2 Max. So a lot of athletes would know about VO2 Max. It's the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can take in when you are performing at your peak. Um, and so that's something that we push to increase, high VO2 max, really good for athletes because you have that high aerobic threshold. You can take in lots of oxygen when you're performing maximally. We do that for fish, but how we do it, okay, we're not putting a fish on a bicycle or on, a treadmill in the gym, but we kind
I
of
think that there
modify
would,
it,
if you could do that, there would be a whole lot more funding, because I think people would
right?
love to see a fish on a bicycle.
Well, it gets a little complicated when you have fish that don't swim very well, so you have to get a little creative. But there are ways that we can do this. So when we would do this for a human, we, like our watch is just using algorithms. But if we are in a lab as a human, we would be hooked up to lots of different machines, like you mentioned. So if you can imagine a machine that's measuring how much oxygen you're taking in from the environment, how much carbon dioxide you're exhaling, then probably we're looking at lots of different blood parameters as well, because of course, blood is the way that our body is taking up that oxygen from the environment, transporting it to where it needs to be in our body, releasing it to those tissues like our muscles, our liver, our heart, and then in exchange, grabbing onto some carbon dioxide that we can eventually exhale, right? And as we're utilizing that oxygen to make energy in our body, we've got lots of different byproducts that we can measure as well. So there are lots of things that we can measure. For a fish, it's actually easier because we can just measure the amount of oxygen they take up from the water and use that to kind of estimate their metabolism. So if you can imagine a fish in a tube of water, and that amount of water has a certain amount of oxygen in it, and that fish is swimming fast. And as we keep increasing the speed, so maybe it's kind of like a treadmill, but a water treadmill, the fish has to swim faster and faster and faster. And eventually, maybe the fish can't swim anymore and it gives up. Okay. I'm sure we've all felt that when we've been doing something hard, like running or cycling or swimming. So all along every single speed increment, we can measure how much oxygen that fish is using and see, okay, well, what's its best speed that it's using oxygen the most efficiently? And we can measure that with a computer and with some oxygen probes and then calculate all of those same things that we do for humans. So essentially a VO2 max for fish. But we can also just put a fish in a given volume of water, let it just completely chill out, relax, make sure it's not doing anything crazy like digesting a big meal or anything like that. Basic resting cost, measure how much oxygen it requires for that as well. So those are two very important metrics that we can get. They're pretty much the same as what we do for humans. We can also put little heart rate loggers into a small fish as well and see how their heart rate changes under different types of activity. And not only that, but during that activity, we could maybe expose them to warmer temperatures or lower oxygen or other different environmental conditions. So it's not that different than what we would be doing for humans, although we have to just do it on a much smaller scale. And sometimes we have to waterproof the equipment that we do use because maybe they're attached to the fish and the fish is going to be swimming in its environment. And we've got a triaxial accelerometer that's kind of like the one that's in our watch or in our phone that we can also attach to the fish to see like how fast and the different directions it's swimming in. Have to download the data from that. There's so many things that we can adopt from our human technology, miniaturize it, waterproof it, put it on a fish and do the same thing and get some of these same estimates, these same pieces of data that can tell us how they're coping with their environment.
It sounds so cool.
It is, yeah. And I got to tell you, the blood is the most interesting. That is my favorite thing to look at in any of these organisms. I mean, kind of nicknamed fish vampire, shark vampire. I will willingly take a blood sample from anything and measure as much as I can from it. We use some of the point of care devices that like a diabetic would use to measure if they are if their glucose is too high or too low. We often talk about, like the keto diet. People like to go into a ketosis. Well, that can also tell us a lot about how fish and sharks are using fuel as well. Like if they're going into more of a starvation type of energetic state, lactate, we can measure that with a really easy device. There's so many things we can do that we've adopted from all these different human technologies. But yeah, blood, absolute favorite.
Fantastic. And what are we learning from the blood? What are we learning from all the data? Can you cluster the findings so far?
Well, the blood can tell us how well they are transporting oxygen throughout their body. And
they were fantastic at that, no?
Yeah, I mean, I've done the comparisons in a lot of my previous work. I mean, compared to us humans, fish way better. And the data actually show that fish are about 50 times better at releasing oxygen to their body, to their tissues, like their muscle, 50 times better than we are. Very efficient. But yeah, I mean, like those are things that we can definitely communicate under different conditions. So we can say if one environmental stressor like rising temperatures, for example, is influencing the most important process any organism has to do, transport oxygen, the most important. The blood can tell us how quickly they're recovering from exercise, which is important if you have to get away from a predator or chase a piece of food, right? It's some things are way more precious, way more life threatening for a fish than they are for us. I mean, maybe if we skip a meal, it's not a big deal. We don't have to chase our food anymore. We don't have to hunt for our food. But, that is the reality. So that could be life or death for a lot of these coral reef fishes, sharks, all of these marine organisms. And if their environment is so challenging that it's influencing their recovery rate, that's a big problem. Some biomarkers for starvation, that's also something that we can get from the blood. So much information from the blood.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation that basically when heat goes up, the metabolism also accelerates. I did that mistake again and compared that to myself. If it's a very hot day in summer, I'm not that hungry anymore. And yet at the same time, I also don't have to hunt for my own food, right? I can just walk into a supermarket, grab something out of the shelf and eat my calories. But if I imagine that during that heat, I would have to hunt after something to eat, I have to walk to the forest to gather food, then probably I would also burn more energy. Does that image make sense? Like, can we imagine it in that way? That everything just gets way more exhausting for these little fish?
And the trade-offs have to happen. So, okay, it's warmer, you have a higher metabolism, so you're going to need more food, but then it costs so much more energy to find that food. So what do? We work with an awesome species of shark here in my lab in Australia. It's called the epaulet shark, and it's one of the walking sharks. Super quirky, beautiful little shark, not very bitey, very easy to keep in the laboratory.
Did you say
They develop
walking shark?
They're a walking shark, yeah.
So do they
They
have
have
feet?
these modifications in their fins that actually turn their fins. They rotate. So it looks as if they're walking along the ocean floor. And they will actually walk out of a small rocky reef pool if they don't like it, and they'll get into another one. So they do walk.
So he can't
When
put
you
them on a
want them
treadmill.
to, they walk. So this species is super, super interesting for us to work with. They're great for the laboratory. They develop in an egg, so we can investigate all the different life stages of this shark species, from the 4.5 month period that they're developing the egg. The little embryo gets bigger and bigger and bigger. They have a yolk in the embryo that they feed off of while they're developing. And, just kind of like a chicken, right? So chicken's developing in an egg, it feeds off the yolk. And then at some point, this baby shark hatches and it absorbs all of that yolk as energy. And after it uses it up, at some point it has to hunt for its own food and learn how to be a shark, okay? And then it grows up and eventually turns into an adult shark and hunts for its own food. Brilliant system. So, really interesting thing about this shark, it lives in super shallow water on the reef flats where it gets really, really hot in the daytime. Now, if it's really hot in the daytime, you don't want to expend too much energy. And what we find is that this shark, in the middle of the day when it's so, so hot, it just hides and does nothing. And in fact, it drops its metabolism by about half during the daytime because it just hides. It's like, you know what? It is too expensive to be doing anything right now. I am just going to relax. I'm going to hide in the coral. I'm going to hide from the predators. I'm doing nothing. And as soon as the sun goes down, the water temperature cools off just a little bit, this shark comes out of its hiding place, starts hunting for food, and is twice as active. It has twice the metabolism at night that it does during the daytime. It's a little bit cooler. It can, be out moving around a little bit. And that's its strategy. So, nature has a way around things. naturally. This is, one of the most fascinating things to observe an organism in its environment and see how it's doing things. But there are limits, and we're pushing those limits. So is it going to be a time where even the night temperatures are too warm for this shark? It's a great question. Will there be enough food for this shark? That's a great strategy for this shark right now that just kind of hangs out in the daytime, takes a nap, does not really move around very much at nighttime, active, temperature's a bit lower, can be out and about hunting, getting some food, digesting. Everything's cheaper because the temperature is a bit lower. How long do we have that window of time? That's a great question.
No. You mentioned something earlier where you simulate different times throughout the century in the lab. Now, we're certainly going through the first man-made climate change, but it's not the first time that the climate changes on the planet itself, right? And this is not going into one of those weird rabbit holes where I'm denying climate change. Where I want to go is more the evolution of species. Is there any historical data that one can learn from and say, it's like, okay, when it got colder, these species in the ocean basically died, or when it got warmer, these are the ones that died and a new kind of species emerged? How much do we know about the evolution of these fish species?
Well, I think that's one of the most compelling things about studying fish, and that includes sharks. Sharks, from an evolutionary perspective, have been on the planet for 450 million years. The bony fishes have been on the planet for over 400 million years, and yeah, they've experienced dramatic cooling periods, dramatic heating periods where the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was much higher than it is now, where oxygen was much lower than it is now. And, that really suggests to us that they are adapted to a changing environment, and that they are, probably the most successful organisms with a backbone to ever exist, really. And, they make up over half of the organisms with a backbone on the planet today. So
There
very
was such a
successful.
crazy stat for me. It's like, maybe we can shine a light on that real quick again. 50% of
Yeah. So if you
species.
count every single species on the planet with a backbone right now, over half of those species are fish. Remember, humans, we're just one species. We're just one species. Yeah. So yeah, fish really dominate, and they have these adaptations that allow them to thrive in a challenging environment. But what's most concerning right now is this rate of change in terms of increasing temperature, increasing fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere, namely carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Those changes that are really changing their habitat, their environment so quickly. And it's that rate of change that is so alarming to us scientists, because we cannot see adaptation happen fast enough to keep pace with those changes.
Do you see any form of adaptation in the fish already? Any change in behavior, any migratory decisions they take? Are they potentially going lower in the ocean towards cooler zones, but then probably oxygen levels are not the same anymore? What is happening in the reefs today?
Well, okay, so we can think of this as a few different choices. So the adaptation choice is number one. So you can change your DNA over multiple generations to cope with the changes in your environment. And so that is one strategy. Okay, we might not be able to do that fast enough for some species, especially like the sharks. They have a really slow generation time compared to, say, Nemo. So it just depends on which species you're looking at. Some sharks take a decade to reach sexual maturity. If you talk about something like the Greenland shark, I think they take 150 years to reach sexual maturity. And then they reproduce and maybe have a few babies. And then they take another, long period of time to reach sexual maturity. So We just don't have that generational turnover in some of these species to have those changes happen fast enough. So adaptation might not be an option for a lot of species, especially those with the longer generation times, like our sharks, rays. Whereas some of our bony fishes, Nemo, some of the colorful damselfishes could have a faster turnover rate, but we still might not see those changes happen fast enough. So that's adaptation. Second option, move. Just move to a better place, right? You don't like your neighborhood, go somewhere else. So if your reef is too hot, can you move to a cooler reef? Okay, so yes, that could be a possibility. We're seeing a dramatic shift in a lot of populations of species poleward, so to cooler habitats, maybe those that get a lot more fluctuations, get cooler, maybe don't get as hot in the summertime, go deeper. So, yeah, deeper water. Is that the option for all species? Well, there are some species that are only associated with one species of coral, for example. Okay, like there are goby fish that can only live in a certain type of coral. So that would not be an option for them. Our little epaulet sharks, or little walking sharks that I was telling you about, they can't go very far either. Their entire living space for their entire lifespan is about the size of my house. Not very
Really?
big. So, not an option for every species. And so this starts to limit things, really. And then you have to think, okay, well, could we just have differences in populations depending on where they live? And that is something we see, at least with some of these colorful coral reef fishes, like the damselfishes, Nemo, that we'll see that northern populations are quite different than southern populations. They're a product of their environment. They show us local adaptation. They have different traits than their southern counterparts. We see that with the epaulet shark. So the epaulet shark is endemic to the Great Barrier Reef area. So that means that naturally in the wild, that is the only place that that species is found. It's found in a lot of aquariums as well, but I mean, naturally in the environment. So can we compare the most northern populations to the most southern populations? We do, and they're actually a little bit different.
Mm.
So that does give us a little bit of hope that some of those changes can happen on a local scale. But again, it's the pace of change that's really alarming, because we are changing these conditions. We're changing their training arena, their environment faster than they've ever faced before.
I have one follow-up question on that north-south topic, because, I mean, everybody's also talking about that the Arctic is heating up at a record pace. Is there any comparison study done in completely different environments, so to say? So I have no idea about the Arctic, if there's also reef, but I assume there's no Nemo in Antarctica. Do we know how the fish there cope with climate change? Is it comparable?
Well, I mean, the poles are heating up at a faster rate than the global average. We're seeing, a lot of the ice sheets that are warming, they're warming and melting. So that is definitely an issue. We have species that are endemic to those regions as well that won't have a place to go. Will they start to move more toward more away from the poles? Well, there's no place colder for them to go. Why this matters? Well, this is going to affect things like sea level rise. That's going to affect our coastal ecosystem. So even though that polar amplification is quite far from where we are here in the tropics and on the coral reefs, that sea level rise will affect all these coastal ecosystems, the reef systems, the low-lying habitats. We're already seeing, a few small island nations climate change refugees because of sea level rise. So everything's connected. All the changes that we're seeing in the Antarctic and the Arctic are affecting all aspects of the ocean and the land as well. And of course, as those ice sheets, as the polar ice melts, then more heat is being absorbed by the oceans, and that's going to further warm the oceans and the atmosphere. So it doesn't just result in this linear response. It can be very dramatically sped up by what's going on at the poles. And it's something that we don't really think about that often because, kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's only talking about how maybe the jet stream will collapse and all that, right? These macro things. But the more I listen to you, the more it sounds like you're basically a canary in the coal mine, because what's happening in the oceans is very well transferable to land, right? It's like, how are we gonna adjust to these things? We might not be as sensible to these temperature changes as fish because we have our mechanisms of cooling down and all that. But as you said in the intro, we also need a healthy ocean to be alive. And as far as I understand so far, I'm not a marine biologist. I'm trying to teach myself to know more and more. Reef ecosystems are also some of the most productive ecosystems in the ocean, where the majority of life sits, where also those that depend on protein that comes from the ocean primarily source their protein. So it's very alarming. And I have to admit that my heart is getting heavier and heavier the longer our conversation goes. Is there anything in your research that suggests hope, that there's and I know that I drew you down this rabbit hole, so this is not on you, but it was my curiosity leading. Is there, like, how do you stay sane if you see these warning signals all day long?
Yeah, gosh, yeah, you absolutely have to have hope. I mean, I don't know. I think it's just on a day-to-day basis for me. It's no longer a future problem. It's happening now, but I think that the ocean has some of those some of the best stories of adaptation and resilience. And the more we learn, the more we understand, the more we dig deep into how all of these other organisms on the planet function. We're only one species. We should be a bit more humble. I think that the more hope we can have. And I don't think hope is passive either. I think that hope is data. It's field work, it's community, it's more of an active term for me. I find hope in the species that I examine, hope in the students that I get to mentor through my career, and all of that helps me understand resilience as well and how to build on resilience, both I guess in the ecosystems that we examine, the species that inspire us, and then figuring out how to change policy to protect them.
Do you feel like science is listened to, especially now for the case of the Great Barrier Reef, for example?
Is science listening?
No, the other way is policy listening to
With policy
science.
listening. You know, here in Australia, we kind of go back and forth about, some of these big issues. The Great Barrier Reef being on the line for losing its World Heritage status. Is that a good thing? Is that a wake-up call? Or is that a bad thing because of tourism, because of all of the, tens of thousands of jobs that a healthy Great Barrier Reef ensure? Where are we as scientists in terms of that policy, community access? It's really important for me to make our findings, the science that we do, accessible to the people that can make change happen, to the decision makers, to the policy makers. We've got some amazing senators, some amazing representatives here that are in parliament and advocating for a reduction in coal, reduction in oil, reduction in fossil fuel use, tax cuts for clean energy, and all of that for protecting a healthy reef, strengthening our environmental laws. And I get to interact with a lot of those politicians, policymakers often. A great way that I get to do that is as president of the Australian Coral Reef Society. We're able to put statements into Parliament about big issues and to advocate for some of these big issues that we've got the science, we've got the evidence to back up the reason why a policy should change one way or another. Are we being listened to? I think better than ever. Is change happening not fast enough? Are there still lobbyists? Are there still interest groups around practices that are toxic for our environment? Absolutely. But I think the more technology, the more communication, I think change is happening. And we protect what we love. So at the end of the day, if I can get you to fall in love with our little walking shark or with Nemo or with some of these gorgeous underwater ecosystems that I get to call my office, if you watch a documentary, which is what inspired me to get into this career in the first place, on
Which
TV,
documentary
a
was that?
movie. Oh, just
Was there one
anything. Like
specific?
I was
Anything?
No, nothing specific. I was just watching anything I could find on the oceans when I was growing up. National Geographic, that's where it was at for me. And I just wanted to be underwater. It was beautiful. And nowadays we've got, just such talented filmmakers and photographers, and we're sharing information in, nanoseconds on social media. And that helps too. Just painting that picture for people that aren't underwater, that aren't seeing what you see on a daily basis. So I think that helps as well. Taking down some of those stigmas that people have. Like I work with sharks. People expect sharks to be giant, fearsome. But sharks are also the future for our marine life, for our coral reef ecosystems. Some of the sharks that I work with are just tiny little wiggly little sharks that are harmless, and they're absolute champions in terms of coping with their environment. So I think that's something pretty special as well.
I love your lens of the athletes because it makes it so relatable to some degree, because there's so many people that strive for performance, right? That can help me to go into that passion a bit more again. If you would have a chance to take someone diving to convince them of, I don't know, either committing money or energy or time on protecting the oceans, where would you take them? What would you show them?
Well, I've talked to you a little bit about Lizard Island in the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. Absolutely stunning. There's a dive called Cod Hole, and there are these big grouper. They call them cod, but they're these huge fish, and they're so docile and beautiful. And just to think that something that big, and they're very old too. So they're slow growing, they're long living, can thrive. And I don't know, just the colors of these reefs, so diverse. My favorite dive of my entire life is in French Polynesia, where I do a lot of my research. And it's a place called Fakarava. It's been known because of the amount of sharks that live in this very, very small area. And it's humbling to be amidst so many sharks. And during the daytime, so docile, just slowly swimming, but you might see hundreds of them, and just this absolutely blue, picturesque backdrop, and these silhouettes of these docile sharks, just relaxing in the daytime. But at night, totally different story. That's when they're feeding, that's when they're active. They're cooperative, feeding with each other, even different species of sharks feeding together, hunting together. And it is insane. It is absolutely stunning. So I would take people there. I think another really special place also in French Polynesia is the shallow nurseries, the mangroves, the lagoons where we work. That's where life starts for a lot of these organisms, these coastal habitats that are shallow enough so big predators can't get into them, shallow enough because they also have a lot of food, a lot of productivity, a lot of life. So that's where we study a lot of the baby sharks, and they're really special to see. Sometimes we are able to see baby reef sharks that might only be a week old and pristine, not as a mark on their body. Just really, really special to see that. Starting to lose my voice here.
Yeah,
You get me going on my favorite topic, and I won't stop.
that's good.
I mean, I think every time I'm underwater, I realize how small I am. We kind of get back to that. We humans were only one species. There are over 32,000, arguably over 32,000 different species of fish on the planet today. So I think that the fish are absolutely amazing to study. Every body of water on the planet they have inhabited, super, super warm, super, super cold, all the way down to, below zero. Fish that live in Antarctica, they're almost completely transparent. The desert pools they live in, high altitude, super, super deep, low oxygen, low pH, high pH. They can do it all. And it's that, 450 million years of evolutionary history that provides them with all these adaptations that allow them to do that. And so I think that they're just, you know, from a curiosity perspective, the best subject. And as an athlete, pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, when I listened to your TED Talk, I was also kind of remembering my own experience and how you can see how quickly they change direction, how they burst with energy if something happens around them, like from 0 to 100. They don't seem to get cramps or anything or pull a muscle or any of that. So evolution did them very well. To close off, I want to ask you two questions. First of all, you mentioned at some point during our communication that it was a week of standing up for your own values. Do you ever feel pulled in different directions with research? Maybe because you're saying something that people don't want to hear, or where is that coming from? If you can share.
This week, well, actually over the past week, I have been reminded that I am very much a leader and that that's an important value for me. My integrity, honesty, standing up for what's right. And that goes in my personal life, that goes in my professional life. Science isn't just about discovery, although it's my favorite thing about science, but there's a lot of responsibility that comes with science as well. I can't just spend my career documenting all of the cool things that fish do, but I also document all of the impacts of climate change, how human influence is affecting all of these coral reef ecosystems that I love. And I can't do that and then stay silent about what's causing it. So I have to stand up for science. I have to stand up for the truth about what we humans are doing to the ocean. And I think that's part of my job description, even if it's not actually written down. And I think while I've built my career studying and researching resilience in fish and sharks, I think that resilience in people matter as well, like almost just as much. So when we are standing up for what we believe in, for evidence-based decision making, for conservation, for climate action, it's not easy. But silence isn't an option, especially when you see what's at stake, the beauty, the biodiversity, the protection that the oceans give us. Silence is not an option.
I'm so grateful for the work that you do and for sharing also these stories with me. That means a lot. And during my preparation, I saw that you actually have quite the team around you by now. And this is what I basically want to end on. Where's your research headed? What comes next?
Gosh, every time we do another study, we end up with 20 more ideas. I remember when I was first starting out and I thought, oh, I'm never going to have enough ideas to become a real scientist. And now I can't turn them off. We are really interested in identifying insurance populations of sharks around the world, sharks that are doing well, sharks that can tell us some of the secrets to coping with climate change and compare that to some of the populations that aren't doing so well so that we can do something, so that we can change some policies and make some change happen. I get the luxury and privilege of working in one of the largest shark sanctuaries in the world in French Polynesia and arguably the best managed marine park in the world here on the Great Barrier Reef. And I think that there are some lessons that we can learn and translate to other places in the world and other ecosystems. So that's really where we're going with our work, using some of these athletic traits to identify who's doing well and who's not.
Maybe we can speak again in a year and see where you stand.
I'd love to.
It's really fascinating, your work. I'm not sure if I envy you or not. I envy you for all the beautiful locations you get to see. I don't envy you for seeing the effects every single day. I can imagine that this also has a toll on you. I hope that policymakers hear this, see this, and adjust, because I don't know, my personal opinion, if we want to change things, they need to also change on policy level. We can't influence the behavior of 8 billion people through goodwill, most likely, but maybe somebody heard this conversation and is inspired to do a little bit more. So thank you so much, Jodie, for all the information, for the research that you do, and for standing up for those without a voice, but with a much better physiology than we have.
Thank you for having me, and yeah, thank you for letting my voice be heard, for the ocean, for future generations, for conservation, standing up for what's right.